Hello and welcome to MediaNama. On November 18, the Competition Commission of India announced that it had imposed a rupees 213.14 crore penalty on Meta, citing anti-competitive practices linked to WhatsApp's 2021 privacy policy update. The CCI argued that the policy, which required users to consent to having their data from WhatsApp shared with other Meta companies, presented a take it or leave it situation to users, given Meta's dominant position in the messaging app market and network effects. The CCI delineated two markets. One was the OTT messaging market, while another was the display ads market. The CCI argued that by requiring data sharing from WhatsApp users, Meta was essentially using its dominant position in the messaging market to protect its position in the display ads market. This made it difficult for new entrants to gain access to the latter market and thereby was an abuse of its dominant position. Expert opinions on the ruling have been varied, some criticizing the CCI's decision. With me is Meghna, director of the ECS Center, who has argued that the order lacked doctrinal coherence and was based on experimental and unproven theories. Hello, thank you for coming here.
Having me.
To start with, could you please give us a fairly brief overview of what your complaints are about the CCI's ruling and its fine on Meta?
Yeah, so essentially, Section 4 of the Competition Act empowers the CCI to check abuses of dominance. Basically, if there's an entity that's dominant in a market, there's certain types of conduct that are delineated as what would possibly constitute an abuse of dominance. So one, in this immediate case, one was 42C, which is exclusion of rivals, and the other one is 42E, which is basically leveraging your position in one market to protect or enter another one. That's 42E. I have a problem with leveraging, but as a theory in general, and maybe we can get into that later, but we can focus on 42C. Essentially, what the CCI is saying is that in the OTT market, where it found Meta to be dominant through WhatsApp, that WhatsApp is a dominant entity there, it said that the data that it is sharing from WhatsApp with other Meta entities is basically a means of excluding rivals from the online display advertising market. Now, I don't know how it can come to this conclusion when one, Meta is not dominant in the online display market by its own admission. Two, somehow the CCI has also concluded that if other entities combine data in this way across different platforms, it's okay and it counts as something that is competitive and innovative because they don't have the scope and scale to take over the market, which again, there's no real evidence that's been adduced of this. This is just a conclusion that they've given with, again, no evidence. And the third thing, another thing that they have also concluded separately is that it is impossible for others to compete with Meta on ads. So there's a kind of strange circuitous logic that's been used that is quite contradictory and also very confusing. But essentially, what they're saying is that on the one hand, Meta is not dominant, but on the other hand, somehow its specific conduct, and specifically in the context of WhatsApp data being shared, leads to the exclusion of rivals. Again, no evidence of this. And also that if other entities do it, let's say Meta has, and this is just a hypothetical, let's say Meta has 300 million users and an entity that has 100 million users. If that entity does the same thing, it doesn't count as exclusion of rivals. It counts as competitive or innovative conduct. But then how can you say and then you finally say, whatever, that no one can compete with Meta. So if you're saying that they can't, they're not innovating, how are you also saying that their product is so good that no one can compete with them? And then at the same time, if you're saying that no one can compete with them, how is it that they're not dominant in this market? So it is a problem of experimental antitrust, where basically these theories have emerged from the European Union, which has started with the conclusion that big tech is bad. Big companies in digital markets are bad, not even dominant ones. Big companies in digital markets are bad. And so you start with that premise and then you try to manipulate, rework evidence or theory around your conclusion rather than looking at how digital markets actually evolve. And I mean, some key principles, and I think probably the best person to look to for this is Carl Shapiro, and he wrote about this in 2009, is that there are many caveats to the premise of network effects and things like that. Yes, networks rule, but innovation is king in these markets. And if the CCI, and basically the CCI is relying on this theory of market tipping, which essentially concludes that the entity in digital markets, the entity with the most user data, the market will tip in its favor, will end up monopolizing a market because they have the lowest marginal cost of innovation. If that is the case, then why aren't apps then the Indian government, I'm sorry, the pollution is really messing with my throat. Then the Indian government will be the number one innovator in the country, right? Because they have the largest repository of data. But that's not the case. There has to be continued investment in understanding of what your customers want on both sides of the market. And if what the CCI was saying is conclusive, then you would not have the rise of entities like TikTok, where, okay, fine, it had a smaller market, like, a closed market like China to first build out in, but then it created a globally competitive product and, in fact, beat out Meta platforms in 2022 as the most downloaded social media app, almost downloaded app, I think, in the world, despite being banned from India, which is a huge digital market. So, I mean, the thing is that if you're going to deal with theories, then they have to be a little more conclusive, particularly with this theory, because no evidence is being adduced. And essentially, an effects based analysis, which they're required to do by precedent, even for Section 4 cases, they're required to look for evidence basically of harm. They've basically concluded that we don't have to look for evidence of harm. We can just, kind of hypothesize about the potential for harm. But if you're going to be dealing in suppositions and presuppositions, then you have to be, you have to be coming from a place where your foundation is more concrete and there aren't so many contradictions in your arguments. That is my broad kind of problem with it. And the larger problem is not that, also the other thing is that it kind of breaks away from the scheme of the act, right? The scheme looks at abuse of dominant entities. And okay, for 4.2e, you don't necessarily have to be dominant in the other market, but for 4.2c, you absolutely do, which pertains to the exclusion of rivals. And over here, basically, what they've said is that it's not about the conduct of a dominant firm, it's about the conduct of a large firm. And ultimately, they talk about the interesting, the ironic thing is they talk about legitimate expectation of WhatsApp's users before this privacy policy was put in place. But industry has, the doctrine of legitimate expectation kind of works both ways. And if a regulator can basically do whatever it wants, stray very far from the scheme of the act, and not stay within the confines of what is statutorily prescribed, then it creates a really bad precedent where you don't know what to expect and you don't know, how to kind of navigate the space of antitrust. And the scary thing is that in the context of antitrust, it's very often cases are filed by people who have motivated interests because essentially they're your competitors, or let's say they're your customers in some way and they want to kind of leverage an antitrust litigation in favor of a better deal or something like that. But essentially, you are dealing with two motivated parties. Particularly, generally, the informant is a motivated party because they are a competitor or something else. So it is in their interest to kind of, I don't want to use the word attack, but to um, create some kind of friction for you in the way you operate in the market. I'm not saying that it's always the case, but it's definitely been misused that way. And so, I mean, all the more the regulator has to be very careful when it goes into these determinations. I think I think the intentions are obviously good, but there are a lot of unintended consequences that can emanate from it. And we've done a lot of research on, benefits of targeted advertising for particularly Indian MSMEs, and we found that it's extremely helpful for them for revenue generation, for a bunch of efficiencies like time saving, cost saving. They prefer it to traditional ads. Majority of them find it cheaper than traditional ads, find it easier to use. They use it for customer acquisition, both Indian and foreign. So, I mean, if you're stopping a pretty sizable entity from sharing data, and we know the effects of this, it essentially does impact personalized advertising to a certain extent. What are the knock-on effects of that order? And I mean, theoretically, since we are dealing with presuppositions, theoretically, the knock-on effects would be that um, you decrease competitiveness in other markets, because targeted advertising has been found by multiple researchers, including us, to lower barriers to entry for MSMEs across different markets. It enables them to compete uh, compete with in large incumbents, basically because it lowers the cost of marketing and promotion, and obviously matching with different consumers. So I think all these things have to. I mean, the competition regulator is very, very powerful, and the decisions that it makes can be market shifting. Not only in the immediate market that it is dealing with, but have broader effects as well. And so for that reason, I think they have to be extra careful with the determinations that they make and really think them through before they make them.
Understand that. Thank you very much. There was definitely a lot to unpack here, and a lot of things that I want to get into. So, one of the very beginning, I just wanted to I noticed a sort of incongruence when I was reading the CCI's press release and when I was reading your article. I noticed that the CCI said that it delineated two markets, that Meta was in a dominant position in the OTT messaging market. And then it said, and I quote, in a leading position relative to its competitors in the display ads market. So I was hoping if you could somewhat explain what precisely that distinction is, because on a surface level, to be leading relative to one's competitor is the same as being dominant. And also, I wanted to ask, what exactly is a dominant entity? Can there only be one? Can there not be numerous dominant entities? So if there can be multiple ones, why isn't Meta one in the display ads market?
I mean, you're basically suggesting there being an oligopoly or something like that. So, I think there is precedent on duopoly, or whether it can be looked into or not, but I can't remember it, so I won't get into that. They've said leading position, but then if you go down further in the order, they've concluded that Meta is not dominant in online display advertising. It's just, and that is another, I think, problematic thing, right? That if you're saying that it's leading, you're basically trying to lead your reader into thinking that it is dominant, even though you've concluded later on that it is not. You've unequivocally said that. And if you go further down the order, they do say that. I'm sorry, I forgot the next part of your question. If you could repeat it.
Could you just tell me into a little bit about what exactly a dominant entity is supposed to be? No, why can't there be more than one dominant?
I mean, a
Sure.
dominant entity is basically the largest entity, depending on whichever parameter the CCI decides. I think in this case, it's decided cost per impressions, um, uh, or basically on the basis of impressions, which again I think is problematic, because the way online advertising works, there are many means through which people can pay. It's not only cost per impression, for instance. But they've taken that as the single most important thing because the DG decided that that was the single most important thing. So none of it is really empirically informed. And of course, I guess the other important consideration is that they've basically taken evidence from competitors who, like I said, have an interest in saying that yes, Meta's conduct is not proper, and yes, it is impossible to compete with because, I mean, it's in their interest to kind of stymie an entity that is their competitor, right? So how can you objectively rely on depositions from these entities that have vested interests as evidence? It is, I mean, in my mind, I don't know. I don't think it's a very. I mean, it's not one. It's not constructive. But It's not very logical as well. So yeah, I mean, I think I'll stop there.
Okay, but don't you think it's the competitors of any dominant player in any market that will be most affected by it? So I'm not sure if there's necessarily, I wanted to ask if this problem.
Wait. 1 second. We're talking about protecting competition, not
Yes.
protecting competitors, okay? And
Okay.
so of course, competitors will be affected by people they're competing with. If I'm competing, okay, fine. If I'm competing with you, let's say in a race, and it's a bad analogy, but if I'm competing with you in a race, and let's say that the referees, I'm very fast, and the referees are like, oh, is she taking something? And then she asks, and then the referees ask, not, I mean, don't test my blood, okay, to see if I'm taking something, but they ask you guys instead, and my competitors, and you have an interest to get me disqualified because then it makes it easier for you to win. Not all of you do, perhaps, but some of you definitely. And so some of you will say, yeah, she's definitely taking something. I've heard this, I've spoken to her teammates, I've spoken to her coach, etc. She's definitely taking something. Do you think that's objective? Do you think that that is, I mean, it's not even fair in some senses, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to get, if you're dealing in theoretical constructs, which you are in this context, there has to be some kind of evidence that is adduced, not merely determinations without any kind of evidence. I mean, for instance, even in the context of Meta, and the innovation threshold, because that's a pro-competitive justification for conduct, right? The CCI has merely concluded that no, Meta doesn't innovate without giving any evidence of it. And I know it's hard to prove, but it's hard to prove both ways. It's hard to prove that a company hasn't innovated, and it's hard to prove that a company has. And again, there the CCI has contradicted itself because it said that on the one hand, Meta is just doing this to protect its position in other markets. It's only doing this to exclude rivals. But at the same time, I'm basically combining data, but at the same time, it's saying, oh, no one can compete with them because their targeting is just so good. And it's not only by virtue of data, having data, that you create products, right? It's investment in analytics, it's investment in talent. And even when you do all of that, it doesn't necessarily translate into a world beating product. So I think like we have to be a little more careful in how we make these determinations.
So the other thing I wanted to talk about is basically if when I was reading the Committee on Digital Competition Law, the report that came out alongside the Digital Competition Bill in the I think earlier this year, a couple of points that they made was basically one of which is I think you touched upon, one that collecting aggregates of data provides a competitive advantage to a particular player. The other part, I think they said, is that the way the digital market are very dynamic, they evolve very quickly. So, is it not better for a regulator to be a little bit forward thinking, perhaps even experimental in its approach?
No, it's not, because digital markets are very unpredictable and you don't know how they're going to evolve. And we're seeing in Europe why it's not good for a regulator to be experimental in their approach. They came out with the Digital Markets Act is basically based on EU precedent. They have taken a single case, and that's the other thing to consider is that case by case things vary in different in different antitrust litigations. Conditions vary, context varies. This is the reason why ex post is slightly better, because every time you're dealing with a different situation. And of course, like, these theories are not necessarily unequivocal. Um, and we're seeing in Europe, the kind of pitfalls of jumping the gun on digital antitrust, on ex ante legislation, digital antitrust. So I'll give you the example of self-referencing, something that basically everyone says is, absolutely unjustifiable, unequivocally anti-competitive, right? So the European Union, the Digital Markets Act in the European Union bars gatekeepers from self-referencing. That includes, of course, Google. And essentially what happened is that Google, so when you go on Google search, let's say you look for a hotel, the first thing that pops up is the Google hotel search tool. I don't know if you've seen it. I'm sure you would have if you've looked for a hotel on Google. Have you?
I have actually. So yeah, there's a search tool.
Yeah. So now, after the Digital Markets Act, Google can't put that tool up, okay? And definitely can't be the first hit. And what has been discovered is that that tool was not hotels that were paying for that positioning. It was all organic. It was just Google saying, "Hey, these are the hotels. I mean, these are some hotels. These are the prices, etc." And that tool was contributing to about 30% of organic search traffic for these hotels. And now, because that tool is not top of the list, or because that tool is no longer there, essentially, the reliance of hotels in the European Union on online travel aggregators has increased manyfold. And in fact, the ad payouts from them to get the same level of visibility, it has increased by about 36%. So basically, what the 30% of search hits that they were getting for free has been eviscerated. And so now a lot of them have come out against the Digital Markets Act because it's obviously really messed with their business, right? A third of search hits have evaporated. And then, of course, it's added to the inconvenience of users. So, for instance, when you'd open that tool, maps would also open with it. But now you have to go to a link, to another link, to another link to get to maps. And I think you can't cross pollinate the two, if I'm not mistaken. And so there are lots of unintended consequences. I'm not saying none of this is well intentioned, of course it is. But there are lots of unintended consequences, particularly to ex ante legislation, and particularly in digital markets, because you don't know how compliance is going to land. You don't know how what the company is going to do to comply with the letter of the law. And you can't, and what the European Union is doing, it's basically straitjacketing these companies because they are complying with the letter of the law. But the European Union is now upset because they're not complying with the so-called spirit of the law, which basically the consequences that are emerging are not those that the European Union envisioned. Big surprise there. And we see it all the time in India as well, right? So I think it's very important to be extremely careful about ex ante legislation. And particularly if the European Union is seeing negative effects, what is the harm in waiting and watching and understanding what happens over there on the ground? Waiting a few years and seeing what happens, whether this is actually worked or not. Why are we reckoning and engaging with these experimental forms of antitrust when we don't know what they're going to result in, and they could result in extremely negative consequences for our economy, as we're seeing over there, right? There's an innovation cost as well. Now companies are just not releasing their AI products over there. They're just refusing to because of the legal uncertainty. And so there's a denial of access to innovation as well, and many other things that kind of go on from that. Now they're saying, in fact, that a lot of European companies are seeking to are considering maybe moving to the US because of its deregulation agenda. Now, I'm not advocating for widespread deregulation the way, Trump has indicated that to the extent that Trump has indicated he will carry out. But it is just something to consider that the European Union has not been a particularly good or useful model when it comes to digital regulation. And I know that everyone lauds the GDPR as this magical um, framework. But if you look at the effects, and now research is coming out about the effects of the implementation of the GDPR. Essentially, what the GDPR did was it decimated data-based businesses in the EU. It made data more expensive. It introduced a huge compliance cost, and there's research to indicate that it led to the exit of millions of apps. And so basically, what the GDPR and larger technology companies were able to, because they had the means, they were able to move to jurisdictions that were, or move headquarters to jurisdictions that were a little more compliance friendly, like Ireland. And so basically, what the GDPR did was it had the effect of entrenching the position of these so called gatekeepers. And now, essentially, what the European Union is trying to do is trying to solve for the market failure created by the GDPR. And we know that this DMA is already creating market failures here as well. So, I mean, it's a never ending spiral of regulation then, because it's market failure after market failure after market failure. And let's not forget, the whole point of regulation is to solve for market failure, not cause it. But the European Union seems to be going the other way. And so why are we following them down this rabbit hole? For what reason? When we're not really losing anything, we have a completely different context to them. We have a lot of Indian entities that are dominant in different digital markets, but we go after them as well. Yes, of course, we should when there is an abuse of dominance, but we have to give concrete evidence of that. And in some cases, the CCI it has adduced evidence, also because it is incumbent on it to do so by precedent. But we cannot be dealing in theories, particularly when they are not unequivocal and there is no evidence to support the position that is being taken.
So there's another part to the CCI's ruling. So one of which was the 4.2c. The other one was the 4.2e, which is protecting the market. Sorry. So the other part of the CCI's ruling was when they said that being in a dominant position in one market allowed it to reach a dominant position in another market, if I'm not wrong, which comes from section 4.2e of the competition.
But it's saying that it's yeah, but I mean, 4.2e doesn't say reach a dominant position in another market. It says protect or enter or one more thing. You don't need to be dominant in the other market. That's true.
Okay. So that's something I wanted to also bring up, because that seems to be the sort of reasoning that they've actually used. The other thing I wanted to ask is, this appears to be somewhat focused more on the potential harms. So this particular section seems to be more forward thinking, or more about the potential for harm. So I wanted to sort of bring your attention to that particular aspect of competition law as well. So do you think it's justified for regulators to be a little bit, let's say, more future thinking or forward thinking in that sense? And instead of looking at the past, when you're talking about evidence of harm, for example, by definition, it requires harm to have occurred in the past. So is it fine if, or what is your opinion or position on the Competition Commission sort of applying more forward thinking, or sort of solving for potential for harm instead of just harm caused in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you're dealing, like I've said before, and I think you'll get sick of me repeating myself. I think if you're dealing with potentiality, you're dealing with something that's theoretical. I think that you have to have a lot more solid basis. So, for instance, Meta, I mean, basically what they're trying to suggest is it's trying to protect its position in online display advertising by combining this data from WhatsApp. What is the difference between protecting your position and legitimately competing in that market? Particularly when you're not dominant. If you're not dominant, then aren't you competing to reach the top? And I mean, I know it sounds circuitous, but I keep coming back to the same thing because how are you drawing that distinction? And the problem is that it's extremely arbitrary. I have a broader problem with this provision in the sense that it basically suggests that if you're an entity that's dominant in one market, you're not effectively allowed to compete in other markets. But if you speak to antitrust experts, particularly in the US, they say that why would you not allow an entity that's good at what it does to compete in another market? They will only drive up the quality of products that are made in that market by entering it, and they won't necessarily corner it, right? So for instance, um, a good example is Zoom. Given that Microsoft and Google tend to bundle a lot of their products with Google Meet or Teams, Mm, it could be argued that Zoom, which is a standalone product, should not be able to compete with these guys, right? Because one, so many people use Gmail, so many people use Microsoft software. They have such a huge leg up. But at the end of the day, Zoom is a superior product. We are on Zoom right now. We're not on Google Meet and we're not on Teams. Um, and I think that these things are important to consider. And the problem is that when you're dealing with presuppositions, it starts becoming a little theological, where essentially it's a belief based system that you're working with. And I don't think that belief makes for good regulatory or policy decisions. On the one hand, we talk about evidence based policy making and empirical kind of um, uh, empirical findings to support our positions. But on the other hand, if we're just traveling on the premise of belief, then I mean, it's a bit regressive, is it not? And essentially, when you're dealing with something that is the potential for harm, essentially you're saying is that, oh, I get a gut feeling that this will be harmful, based on theories that I've read that are not unproven and are only now really finding a testing ground in the European Union. Um, and I think, in my opinion, are going to have already led to market failures, are going to lead to a whole lot more. Um, uh, so I think that from that standpoint, I don't think that it is advisable to deal with theoretical things because then it becomes a little theological, it becomes belief based. And if you're then dealing in beliefs, then you're looking at absolutely no certainty, right? From a regulator, you're basically, I mean, it's completely whim based. Yeah, I believe that you're doing the wrong thing. Oh, I believe that you're doing the right thing. It's completely arbitrary. So I don't think that it's conducive to any kind of um, uh, good decision making.
Thank you very much for your time and your expert perspectives. For more tech policy updates, please be sure to subscribe to MediaNama.